I was simply standing there watching. I noticed that, there are a lot more riot police starting to arrive. The police suddenly charge onto the crowd. I was one of the people arrested there for no reason. I was handcuffed behind my back. It seemed really surreal. I mean, I was also in shock. I was held for 20 and a half hours in a police cell. I wasn't charged at any point. In fact, I wasn't even interviewed. 2 officers came into my cell and they said, "Oh, we're arresting you under a further allegation of violent disorder." And I was completely taken aback.
Two-tier policing, two-tier justice, two-tier Keir. Well, we've spoken a lot about all of those things on this show, and in particular how they've been in evidence in the government response to the disorder up and down the country after the Southport murders. Much of this was in towns in the Midlands and the North, but it was in London, outside Downing Street, that my next guest was part of a peaceful protest against knife crime on July the 31st, just 2 days after the Southport attack, when he was arrested, placed in a prison cell, and held for nearly 24 hours. And he's now here to tell us about his ordeal. Welcome to The Sceptic, Alex.
Hello. Nice to meet you, Laurie.
Yeah, good to have you here. Okay, so it's the 31st of July, just 2 days after the Southport attack. And so you work in central London in an office job, and you're coming home in your suit. And so, just remind us, well, what had been reported in the news so far at this point, and what were you thinking at the time?
Yeah, absolutely. It was Wednesday, 31st of July, and I was at work, and I took a little social media break. I think we all do these days. And I just, I went onto X, see what was going on, and I just happened to notice there was this protest event happening, or going to be happening on Whitehall, more or less opposite Downing Street, in the evening. And it was described as being about the increasing knife crime across the country. I was aware of this. I had read that, in the previous sort of 48 hours, I think, there'd been something like 17 knife murders across the country. And, there's an army officer in Kent who'd been stabbed 12 times. There's the Manchester airport attacks that everybody is now very familiar with. Sword and machete fights have been reported in Southend. So this was all over the news. But obviously what topped this, and I think what really hit hard at the heartstrings of the country, was the heinous, atrocious murder of the 3 young girls in Southport. So Baby King, Elsie Stanco, and Alice da Silva Aguilera, all sort of, I think, around 7 to 9. As we know, they were attending the Taylor Swift themed dance event, and this guy, who we now know to be Axel Wodakabana, came in and just stabbed them in cold blood. I mean, it was just so atrocious that I think everybody felt, and I certainly did, really distraught about it. And so I wanted to go there. That's why I went in the spirit of that, and really protesting the lack of government action to deal with this escalating violent crime. I got there about 7:30 that evening. As you say, I was wearing my suit and tie. I had a briefcase, and it was sort of on my way back from work. And I want to say as well that, when I read about it on social media, I didn't see any protest conditions. The only thing I did see, the only thing I saw was that the protest was meant to end at 8:30 in the evening, at 8:30 p.m. There were no other protest conditions that I saw attached to it, and that becomes relevant to what I'm going to say later. But there was nothing to say, well, these are protest conditions. This is what you can and cannot do. I think the whole thing was quite organic. It was quite grassroots, and it was quite sort of organised sort of last minute anyway. It looked like there were a few hundred people there. And one thing I did observe right from the start was that there appeared to be a lot of riot police, or public order police, to give them their technical name, basically policemen with helmets and batons. And that was a bit disconcerting. So I arrived, thinking, oh, maybe this is going to be a bit disorderly, but it wasn't. I sort of arrived there, as I say, about 7:30. I stood on the pavement watching what was going on. I'm quite tall as well, so I'm like 6'4", so I was able to see over a lot of people, and I could see what was happening. And there was a sort of large crowd, and seemed to be gathered mainly in the road. There were lots of people on the pavement as well, and they were sort of they started chanting sort of "Save Our Kids." They seemed to be, but they were peaceful, and I want to stress that there was no violence going on. There was no property wasn't being damaged, anything like that. There was a group of, as I say, probably a few hundred people. It's difficult to tell, but I think I later found out it was sort of several hundred. But what I say, what did strike me is just how many riot police were there, and not only that, how rapidly the number, even after I had arrived, sort of within the next 10 minutes, there were more riot police arriving. It seemed odd because it didn't seem proportional to what was happening.
Right, and so you said you were on the pavement watching the crowd. What was your relationship to the crowd, do you think? How would you characterize it?
Well, I suppose I was observing what was happening, and I didn't actually say anything myself at all at any point, actually, until I was later arrested. I didn't say anything. I was sort of simply standing there watching. And then at one point I decided to stand more in solidarity because, as I say, there were people on the pavement, there were people on the road. The bulk of the people seemed to be in the road. And I saw no difference between because the road was sort of closed off. It didn't seem to me any difference between the road and the pavement. So I walked into the road, literally just step off the curb. No one sort of stopped me. No one said, you shouldn't do that. I certainly wasn't approached by any police officer. I just walked, and I thought nothing of it at the time. And I sort of joined the rest of the group on the road. And I was sort of standing there. I was watching what was happening, really, predominantly.
Okay, so you're halfway mingled with the crowd. You're standing in solidarity with them in the street. What happens next?
So I think about 10 minutes or so pass. So we get to like about 7:45. Now, as I say, I noticed that, there are a lot more riot police starting to arrive. I don't know where they were coming from. I later found out that they were being sort of bussed in from other parts of London, and told, and they'd been told inaccurately that there was this sort of violent, riot going on, which wasn't the case at all. But anyway, so about 10 minutes later, about 7:45, the police suddenly, without any warning whatsoever, and this is important to stress, like there was no announcement to the crowd, there was no megaphone announcement, there was nothing audible that I heard, and to my knowledge, I don't think the police officers approached anyone individually either, saying, please clear the area, otherwise we are going to start arresting people. There was nothing like that. Instead, the police suddenly decided, or were ordered to, charge onto the crowd. And this was all quite sudden and sort of spontaneous. So I was sort of standing there, and then I just noticed on my peripheral vision on my right, as I turned my head, and I was like, the police officer was arresting a guy standing to my right. And I was sort of taken aback by this. And at that point, that was the first time I said anything. And I was like, officer, what are you doing? Why are you arresting this man? They started arresting people. And I was one of and I can't go into too many details about my own arrest, but I was one of the people arrested there for no reason, really. I was handcuffed behind my back, and I was taken with others. After being searched, we stood for about 1 to 2 hours opposite St. James's Park, which was quite humiliating. We were just basically standing handcuffed, and people were walking by, and they're like, what's going on? It seemed really surreal. I mean, I was also in shock. I mean, because obviously I hadn't gone there expecting to be arrested. And the reason we were waiting for so long, as I said, we were stood there for about 1 to 2 hours. 1 hour standing opposite the park, and then I spent another hour waiting in the police van. And the reason for that is because the police had arrested so many people. They had arrested about, what I've read, 110 people at that protest. So the upshot of that was that the police didn't have capacity in the police cells, any of the London police cells. They were literally calling up various police stations in London, asking, "Do you have capacity? Do you have space? We've got people here. We need to, take in and bring in." And I was, as I say, I was stood there for about an hour before, and then another hour in the police van. But it was very warm that day, and I was sort of almost feeling faint because I was kind of dressed up in my suit, and I was standing there in the sun, and I was standing up, and I had to beg the police for water, and obviously because I was handcuffed behind my back, they had to literally feed me water from a bottle. It sort of felt again quite demeaning, but that was the what happened. And then, as I say, after about 2 hours, I and another guy in the police van, we were taken to a police station, and we were detained, and this would have been around 10 p.m. ish, and we were held. I was held for 20 and a half hours in a police cell. So that's 3.5 hours less than the total number of hours, 24 hours, that the police can hold anyone without charging them. I wasn't charged at any point. In fact, I wasn't even interviewed in the police station. I was expecting that I might be interviewed, but that never happened. I was simply held in a cell, and I was, I mean, it was a very unpleasant and stressful experience because I didn't know what was going to happen to me. I'd never been in a police cell before, 4 walls. And it was also very, very cold in there. I remember it was freezing cold. I had to ask for 3 blankets in the end because it was freezing. There's no windows. It was like just 4 blank walls and a hard sort of mattress and a toilet, and that was it. Literally everything. So they did allow me to pick a book to read, which was a great saving grace, because otherwise I think I would have, it was extremely boring as well, and that helped me sort of pass the time and escape in my imagination into the book I was reading. I managed to read the whole novel in that time. But about an hour before I was released, and I was released on police bail, so I would have had the police not indicated about, well, in fact, they didn't inform me. My solicitor had to contact them and was advised that the police were taking no further action in my case. But had that not happened, I would have had to return to the police station at the end of October and come in. And so that was, even after I was released, that was also weighing on my mind for about 2.5 months. I didn't know what they were going to do. But about half an hour or so before I was released, 2 officers came into my cell and they said, "Oh, we're arresting you under a further allegation of violent disorder." And I was completely taken aback by that, because I know and knew that I'd been just attending this peaceful protest, and I'd been standing there and I hadn't done or said anything. And that seemed just incredible. And they came up to me and they said, "Oh, we need to take a photo of you because we need to check this against CCTV footage. And then if there was anything violent, then, we would take further action." And I said to them, "Be my guest," and I stood up and this is what I was wearing. And I was very cooperative and I said to them, "Go and review the CCTV footage to your heart's content. I know that I haven't done anything." So that happened, and it seemed bizarre at the time, but what I later found out, because I spoke to other people afterwards who, well, actually at the time, but also afterwards, quite a few other people who had been arrested, they had undergone pretty much the same, with a few changes, but essentially the same situation. So they had also been attending, they'd also, been peacefully protesting. They'd been arrested on the same grounds, which is Section 14 of the Public Order Act 1986. It's breaching protest conditions, even though none of us, and I asked other people who were arrested at the time, were you aware of these protest conditions? And like me, no one, because I was stood there for an hour with other people who had been arrested. So I asked them, I made a point of asking them, like, were you aware of these protest conditions? And nobody had any idea that, they weren't meant to stand in the road. In fact, one of the people about 100 or 200 meters away from me, standing in the road, who was handcuffed and I believe arrested and then promptly de-arrested, was Martin Daubney from GB News. And so he was then de-arrested because he was a journalist, essentially.
And they were live, were they?
Yeah, they were. Yeah. That's right. And that it didn't stop the police. So what I'm essentially getting at is that it was apparent to me that because lots of other people had been arrested under the same grounds and they'd been detained for the same amount of time, their bail conditions were the same, and they were asked to return to the police station on the same date. It seemed very clear to me that rather than taking an individual case-by-case approach and looking at the actual facts and the circumstances, rather the police were simply obeying. They're basically taking a collective approach. It was clear to me that they received orders to arrest as many people as possible on the same grounds, regardless of the actual facts, the circumstances. It seemed very coordinated and it seemed very top down.
So the question I was going to ask you there for a second was, what was it about you that meant they arrested you, or what were you doing? But it seems from what you said there that there wasn't really anything in particular that you were doing that meant they arrested you, but rather that it was almost done completely at random. I mean, is that a fair assessment?
That is a very fair assessment. And actually, I know, in fact, I spoke to a lady who witnessed firsthand police officers talking to each other, and she wasn't arrested, but she was with her husband, and she overheard police officers saying to each other, pick one at random and arrest them. In fact, there's another YouTuber, I believe, who recorded the police saying the same thing. Just pick one at random and arrest them.
They're just arresting people for no reason.
So this is what the police were doing. It's very clear, the people literally standing there And not even people just on the road. It looked like they were also arresting people at random who were on the pavement. So it seemed to me and to many others who were there at the time that the police were trying to make up numbers. They were trying to arrest as many people as possible. To me and to others, it seemed clear that narrative formation was taking place. The fact, first of all, that they had all the riot police there was part of the narrative, regardless of the actual facts. The fact was it was peaceful protest. They had the riot police there so that they could basically say, well, we're responding to a riot and we're taking tough action. But, simply having riot police at an event doesn't make that event a riot. But they can say, oh, well, there were riot police there because it was a riot. That's the implication, you see. And then just arresting as many people as possible then creates headlines, doesn't it? Well, we've arrested all these people. Therefore, they must have been, doing something wrong.
Yes, I mean, it's almost Kafkaesque, isn't it? So there's a headline here in The Independent from about a week afterwards, which is police arrest 121, quote, thugs and criminals after disorder outside Downing Street. And, well, I suppose, if you've arrested them and treated them like thugs and criminals, then maybe you can say that they are thugs and criminals, but, clearly you weren't, right? But anyway, so this was a Wednesday, and presumably you had work the next day. That would have been another concern. How did you deal with that?
Well, I didn't, because I wasn't able to. Obviously, I was in a police cell, and they take your phone away. There's no means of contacting the outside world. So I wasn't able to contact... actually, I tried contacting a friend, but it was not available at the time. But there was no way of, I couldn't, contact work to obviously say, I couldn't obviously tell them when I was finally released. I was sort of so overwhelmed by the whole experience. I think I went to find the nearest pub and I just had some alcohol and then just broke down emotionally. So it was a traumatic experience, put it that way.
So you feel you were very unfairly treated there. And of course, part of the reason we're doing this interview is that you're going to be filing a lawsuit against the police for this. Now, tell us a bit about that and what are you hoping to achieve there?
Well, I think it's important that I do feel very strongly that it was, completely wrong, completely disproportionate. What happened to me and to everybody else there. And I do want to actually talk a bit about other people because they may not necessarily have or feel that they have the same voice that I have by talking to you here. And so one woman who I was in contact with afterwards emailed me and she said that her husband had been struck on the back by a baton. So he wasn't really doing anything. I think he was just sitting there. And in fact, she said there's video evidence of this. And so he was just sitting there and the officer came up and struck him on the back. And then her husband sort of remonstrated verbally with the officer. And then apparently the officer was removed then from the police line. So, I know as well other people who were just literally standing peacefully, they're doing nothing, but they were arrested. There's lots of video footage of that, actually. You can find it quite easily. There's a elderly lady who's literally standing there, she's arrested, and the police were using intimidatory tactics. They were, approaching people, asking, even if they hadn't been arrested, they were going up to people asking for their names and addresses. Why do you want that information? What are you going to monitor these people? What's the point there? So I'm bringing an action for wrongful arrest, and I think I have no illusions that it's not going to take a long time, but I think it's important to seek justice and to gain justice, not only for myself, but for everybody else there, and to be able to advise others what they can do to seek justice as well. There's a whole question as well for whether the police creating those protest conditions and having the riot police there was proportionate in itself. So I've spoken to a friend of mine who's a criminal barrister, and I had a very interesting discussion with him, and he sort of looked up various case law and relating to Section 14 of Public Order Act, so the grounds on which we were arrested. And what he found was, there is a question over, first of all, whether it's proportional to create, first of all, to put in place particular protest conditions, but second of all, to put in place a dispersal order. And then there's another question over whether those conditions and the dispersal order had been sufficiently communicated to the crowd, to the people at the event, at the protest, so that they knew what to do and what not to do. And I'm almost certain that at the very least, some of those tests would not have been met from my own, what I witnessed, and through the testimonies of the multiple people that I've spoken to who were also there. So I think there's strong grounds there as well. Is the point?
So on that question of how the police were behaving, I mean, you mentioned that you heard later that a lot of the coppers that were there that day had been bussed in from other parts of London. And of course, but actually this was only to deal with what was almost entirely, or probably entirely, peaceful protest. What do you think was going through their minds as they sort of were policing you there?
Well, I think it was because of when it was happening. So obviously there had been actual riots that had happened in the north. I mean, police stations had been set ablaze, I believe police vehicles.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.